In April this year, Motorola officially unveiled their first flagship line of phones in over 3 years, the Edge and the Edge Plus. This came at a perfect time for the company as the recent attempted revival of the Razr flip phone went down like a lead balloon. It also came at a good time for me, as my previous phone had developed a fault with the camera, an element that for me at least is especially important. I decided to bite the bullet and bought myself an Edge. The Edge Plus was set to not be available in the UK, but since I had bought the phone, the Edge Plus has been released on the Lenovo store, but not the Motorola store, much to my chagrin. If Motorola somehow watch this and want to send me an Edge Plus to compare the two though, I don't think I'd complain. Let's tell you where I'm coming from in regard to reviewing this phone. The only phones I've ever personally owned have been Motorola ones. This is because I like their general quirks compared to other brands, and they're generally high quality for a relatively low price point compared to brands like Samsung, whose mid-range phones can be a bit lackluster while they focus all their efforts on their flagship lines. I'm not, however, a fanboy who's going to bag on everything not from my favourite brand and ignore all the faults of any device that brand comes out with. In my day job, I am exposed to and have to use almost every single brand and budget of phone you can think of, be it iPhone, Samsung, Huawei, Xiaomi, whatever you can think of. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get into the comparison and review. The main phone I will be comparing the Edge to will be my previous phone, the Moto Z2 Force. Motorola's previous flagship phone. When you look at the raw specs, the Edge seems like it won't do much better. The Z2, if it weren't for the camera being broken, is still a very viable phone to this day, and its specs have held up very well, with it still performing quite nicely after 2.5 years of daily use. If you're in the market for a cheap, good phone, they are available on eBay for a relatively cheap price, but the Force has a few issues, namely the screen has a peeling problem which arises from the layers in the screen becoming unstuck after a while, and I have had to have that repaired on that phone. The camera as well, despite mine being broken, that was my fault, is also a little wanting. A dual camera 12 megapixel array at the back and a 5 megapixel front camera. They're fine, but that's it. The aim obviously was to have the user buy some of the Moto mods, but that scene never really got off the ground far enough to be viable. There was one camera made available from Hasselblad, and for the price, the specs were not that good. Now then, I've set out my bar for comparison. Let's see how the Edge does. The Edge supports a Snapdragon 765G 8-core processor with 4 or 6 gigs of RAM, a setup which is roughly on par with the Z2 in terms of raw horsepower, but seems to have been implemented better in the Edge with the cores more spread out in performance rates. This helps a lot with gaming, giving very stable performance in most gaming experiences. Speaking of gaming, another selling point of the Edge was its 90Hz refresh rate on screens. This has made games much smoother than on most devices of its price point, which is around £550 or $600. The screen is a 6.7-inch waterfall display with a resolution of 1080 by 2340, not the most high fidelity and actually slightly worse than the 1440p display of the Z2 Force, but the refresh rate and overall vibrancy of the display do make up for it. The waterfall display makes for a device that's very sleek looking, but I have noticed a few times where the display has been a little awkward in use. Using apps such as Discord, where server notifications are represented by white marks on the very edge of the screen, aren't visible on the Edge without physically rotating the screen to use in your hand. This isn't really an issue that will affect many apps admittedly, but it's certainly something that you should be thought of when making a waterfall display, along with things such as the cost to the consumer of repairing such a waterfall display compared to that of a more standard flat display, which are significantly cheaper and available to be repaired at a wider range of outlets. Motorola's version of Android is, as usual, very stripped down and clutter-free with only 1 or 2 proprietary apps installed, just how I like it. They have also decided to take advantage of their waterfall display and add several gesture-based controls around it. When enabled, the standard back, home and app tray buttons disappear from the bottom, and the waterfall sides and bottom are given several features. Swiping either edge takes you back a step like the back button would, although they did miss a trick by not letting the right edge become a forwards button in a browser such as Chrome. The bottom, when swiped up, will take the user home, but when pulled up and held, it will put you to the app tray. It will also switch to other apps when swiped to the side, a pretty useful feature to switch quickly between apps without split screening them. Additionally, a button can be enabled on the right edge which has several functions. When swiping it outwards, it opens a quick access app tray that's fully customizable. Swipe up on the little button to open up the app tray, again for the app drawer and a third time to bring you back home. Swipe down to drop the top menu and again for the top menu settings. This whole system did take some getting used to for me, being used to the traditional Android setup, especially the side swiping, but after a while it becomes natural and overall I think I like it. My only gripe is with apps such as Twitter and Discord, etc. They have menus by swiping to the side. For most users this is generally done by swiping from the side of their phone, but this won't work here. Instead you'll need to get used to swiping from the middle. I'm used to it now, but it did take quite a lot of unlearning. The Edge comes with 128GB of internal storage with microSD expansion up to 1TB, and you'll be thankful for that when it comes to taking advantage of its camera system. The Edge boasts a triple rear camera setup with an impressive 64MP f1.8 lens, a secondary 16MP f2.2 lens which can take both macro and wide angle shots, and a third 8MP f2.4 telephoto lens with 2x optical zoom. This is slightly less impressive than the Edge Plus, which has an astonishing 108MP primary lens and a telephoto lens that goes up to 3x zoom. All that said though, this shouldn't detract from the fact that even on the Edge this camera is still seriously formidable for a phone camera. The images from the high-res sensor clocking a whopping 17MB a piece. That's nearly as much as a modern DSLR or mirrorless camera's RAW files. So using that mode will be a serious storage eater if you do not keep an eye on it. Now though, it's time for another "this is where I'm coming from" moment. I'm a semi-professional photographer with a lot of time and experience with cameras, so believe me when I say despite how impressive the camera is, it is still not on par with a good DSLR or mirrorless system when it comes to taking photos. Of course you can take good photos on it, and in fact when you see the mobile photography awards, which are now a thing, it is astonishing what people can take on a phone. However, I do believe you can still take better pictures on a real camera. In an ideal environment you can get an amazingly sharp photo, and all the photos you take will be very high resolution on this phone. But the thing holding it back more than anything for me compared to high-end cameras is the lack of manual control in the high resolution mode. Whilst you can turn all your controls to manual in the other camera modes, when using the high fidelity lens, most of the settings such as aperture, ISO and focal distance are set to automatic. Further compounding this is occasionally the phone will take a second or so to process one of these high-res images, meaning you could miss a shot if you're not careful. This rarely happens when you're using a high-end camera, which even on their best settings can do about 6 to 10 frames per second. After all that, you might think I'm down on this camera, but honestly I'm not. For a phone camera, as I said, I am really impressed. It's still one of the best phone cameras I've ever used. I'm just saying that it isn't without fault. I'll prove to you I'm not down on it by showing you this image of a flower in my back garden I took and zooming in. Honestly, I am so impressed with the amount of detail that is preserved in this image even as we zoom in so far. You also wouldn't have to worry about running out of battery while taking photos, or anything for that matter, with a nicely sized 4500mAh battery which can last for up to 2 days under ideal conditions, or comfortably a day even with very heavy use. For example, I went out for an hour-and-a-half walk recently, properly socially distanced of course, and played Pokemon Go for a significant period of that walk, and took pictures for most of the rest of it. Battery was barely phased. I think I lost about 10%. This in comparison to my old Z2, whose 2400mAh battery was starting to take the strain of its life, was struggling to last a day, and certainly needed a charge if I played some games for any amount of time. This may also be one area where the Edge outperforms the Edge Plus, because while the Edge Plus sports a 5000 mAh battery, it also has higher specs which will cause more power drain, especially taking photos with that 108 megapixel sensor, which will demand a lot of power draw while in use. However, barring the very unlikely event Motorola sends me an Edge Plus to compare, I couldn't tell you for certain. In conclusion, the Edge is very much what Motorola needed to bring to the market, a phone that has flagship level specs, maybe not quite in line with the S20 or the iPhone 11, but also at a much lower price point than those two phones, making it a much better value proposition overall in my opinion. I did go into the Edge with high hopes for their first flagship model in 3 years, and I was not left disappointed. If you can find it, I'd certainly recommend it if you're looking for a good phone but don't have the budget which will stretch to the eye-watering price of the big boys flagships. That's all for this review. It's my first time doing this kind of review, but I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see more of this kind of thing, then please let me know in the comments. Maybe leave a like while you're there. Yes, if you do want me to do more of these, I have a couple of bits of tech that I've got recently I'd like to do maybe a review on if you enjoyed it. And otherwise, thank you very much for watching.